The coach from Abilene arrived on a Thursday late in the afternoon, when the light came in, low and flat across the main street, and every shadow ran long. Most passengers climbed down with the easy looseness of people who had somewhere to be. The last one off was a woman. She stepped down carefully, carrying a travel bag that had seen better years, and she stood for a moment on the packed dirt while the other arrivals moved past her toward people waiting with their names ready. Nobody waited with her name. She had a dress that had been pressed before the journey and had not survived it, and she wore it anyway with the chin level, in the way of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart. She looked at the buildings once, left to right, the way a person reads a situation before deciding how to proceed. Then, she picked up her bag and walked toward the nearest storefront to ask where she might find the land office. People noticed her the way small towns notice things, not rudely, not with any particular hostility, the way a room notices something that does not have a category yet. She did not look at any of them. The man at the land office was a Mr. Beaumont, a clerk with the manner of someone who took pleasure in paperwork and less pleasure in the people who required it. He had a mustache that he kept very tidy and a way of setting papers down that suggested he believed they deserved respect. He found the file she named without difficulty. He opened it. He looked at it. He looked at her. He told her, with the flat efficiency of a man delivering news he had delivered before, that the homestead claim filed by her late husband had lapsed, that the required improvements had not been made in the required time, that the land had reverted to territorial holdings and been reassigned in the interim to a cattle company out of San Antonio. She stood on the other side of the counter and received this. She asked one question in a voice that did not waver. She asked whether there was anything to be done. He set his pen down. He said there was not. He said he was sorry for the inconvenience and looked at a point somewhere past her left ear when he said it, which told her how sorry he was. She thanked him and left. Outside, the afternoon light was still there, going nowhere in a hurry. She stood on the boardwalk and looked at the street, taking stock of a situation that had just changed shape. She had a small sum of money in the travel bag and a letter of introduction from a minister in Kansas that had been meant to accompany the land claim and was now useful for nothing. The hotel at the far end had a sign she could read from where she stood, and she began doing the arithmetic of how long she could stay and what came after. A man across the way was loading fence posts onto a wagon bed, working with the quiet efficiency of someone who did not need to think about the work. He was somewhere past 40, not far past it, with the hands and shoulders of a man who had spent years outside. His coat was good but plain. He worked without pausing, without looking up, and she would not have noticed him particularly, except that when she came out of the land office and stood still in the way she was standing still, he glanced over and saw her. He did not look away quickly the way some people do when they have seen something they do not want to involve themselves in. He looked for a moment, the way a man looks when he is deciding something, and then he finished the post he was loading, set it square, and crossed the street. He asked if she was the Harlan widow. She said she was. He said he had known her husband a little, that they had spoken at a cattle auction 3 years back, that he had seemed like a man who knew what he was doing. He said he was sorry for her loss. He did not elaborate on the loss or make it larger than it was. He asked plainly whether she had somewhere to stay. She told him she had money enough for the hotel. He said he was not asking about the hotel. He said his name was Callum Rourke. He said he had a ranch 6 miles out, that his housekeeper had left in the fall, and that he had 2 children in need of someone with sense to oversee the household. He said he was not offering charity. He said it was work, if she wanted it. He said the wage was fair, and she would have the use of the back room and her board included. He said all of this the way a man reads off a list of things a job requires. No flattery, no warmth performed for its effect. Just the facts of the situation, clearly stated, offered to a person he was treating as capable of evaluating them. She considered him for a moment. He did not fill the silence with more words. She said she would need to think on it. He said that was fine. He told her she could find him at the livery in the morning, and she could give him her answer then. He picked up the last fence post from the pile beside the wagon, loaded it, and drove off down the street without looking back. She watched him go. In the morning, she found him at the livery. She said yes. The road to the ranch ran 6 miles through scrub and open grass, and Callum Rourke did not talk much on the way out. He told her the boy, Thomas, was 11 and not difficult, but had not been easy since his mother passed 2 winters ago. He told her the girl, Clara, was 7 and not a problem in any direction, and said this last part with something that might have been dry appreciation. She asked how the mother had died. He said fever. He said it came fast and it left fast, and by the time they understood what was happening, it was already over. She did not ask more. The ranch was not large. It was well kept in the way of a place managed by someone with no help and no margin. The fences were sound. The yard was orderly. There was no one to greet them when the wagon came in, because the children were at their schoolwork, which Callum had apparently arranged for them to do, regardless of whether he was present. He showed her the house. He moved through it with the practicality of someone identifying the features of a property. The back room, her room, was small and had a window facing east and a shelf with a few things on it: a glass bottle, a carved piece of wood that might have been an animal, a small photograph lying face down. He did not explain any of them. She set her bag down and looked at the shelf without asking about it. He showed her where the flour was and how the stove drew. He told her supper was usually before dark and that the children ate what was made. He said Thomas would help with whatever she asked, whether he looked like he wanted to or not. She said she understood. He went back outside to his work. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands at her sides, taking the measure of the room, where things were and where they wanted to be. Then she tied an apron and started supper. Thomas was, as advertised, not difficult. He had the look of a boy who had decided that the best approach to most things was a steady withholding of reaction, which made him appear older than 11 in a way that was not entirely pleasant to see in a child. He watched her at the stove with a patience that was also a form of judgment, the kind that does not announce itself but is always working. Clara watched her the way a child watches something interesting, open and without strategy, leaning slightly against the door frame with her arms crossed over her chest in the unconscious imitation of someone older. Supper was quiet. Callum ate without comment, which she understood meant the food was acceptable. Thomas ate without comment, which she understood meant something else entirely. Clara ate and asked if she knew how to make bread, because the bread they had been eating lately was hard on one side, and Thomas said Clara's name in a flat warning tone. And Clara said, "What? I am only asking." And Callum looked at neither of them. She said she could make bread. Clara said good and went back to her supper. Callum looked at his plate. The days that followed moved in the practical order of a household that had been waiting for someone to give it a shape. She made the bread, which was not hard on either side. She mended what needed mending. She organized the kitchen the way it wanted to be organized and left the rest of the house as it was, because the rest of the house was not hers to reorganize. She managed Thomas by asking him to do things once, clearly, and then letting the silence after the request do the rest of the work. He complied with it the way he might comply with a direct order, not without resentment, but not without competence either. He was, underneath the withholding, a careful boy, and she noticed this without remarking on it. Clara helped with everything she was allowed to help with and asked questions without stopping, about cooking, about sewing, about whether she had a family somewhere and what they were like. She answered what had answers and deflected the rest with plain practicality, which Clara seemed to respect more than softness. She repaired the step on the back porch without asking whether she should. It had been loose for what looked like several months, and it needed fixing, and she had the tools, and she fixed it. Callum noticed it one evening when he came in from the south field, glanced down at the new nail work, and went back inside without comment. He left coffee on the counter on the fifth morning without saying anything about it. She drank it and said nothing about it either. The town came to her in increments, the way towns do when they are taking the measure of something new, first through Clara, who reported the household's business at school with the unself-consciousness of someone who did not yet understand that information had uses. Then through Mrs. Aldrich at the dry goods store, who was pleasant in the careful way of someone gathering data before committing to anything. Then through the post office, and through the church on the first Sunday, and through the eyes of the street that noted who she sat with and how she moved and filed the assessment accordingly. She understood what people were saying. A widow with no land and no people and an unclear arrangement at the Rourke Ranch. She went about her errands with the same composure she had brought off the coach. She spent no more words than were required. She did not offer explanations, and she did not perform unhappiness to make people feel better about her situation. She simply went about being present and doing what needed doing. By the time the frost settled on the morning glass, she had been at the ranch nearly a month. Thomas had begun staying at the table after supper longer than he needed to. She had not remarked on this. Clara had started sitting beside her in the evenings when she did the mending, not helping, simply present, occasionally asking a quiet question that was really a different question. Callum watched none of this directly. He was simply there in the evenings, in the way of a man who has found that a house feels different when it has the sound of people in it. It was in the fifth week that the situation with the boy arrived. There had been a Comanche raid along the eastern stretch of the territory, the kind that had not stopped entirely, and a boy had been taken from a farm settlement 2 days right out. He was perhaps 8 years old. The settlers had ridden after for the better part of a day before losing the trail and come back without the child and with the particular anger that comes from failure combined with fear. The boy turned up at Callum's property on a Tuesday morning, alone, having apparently walked through the night. He had a cut along his forearm that had gone several days without attention, and his feet were in worse shape than the arm. He sat down on the porch step as though he had arrived at a place he had decided to arrive at, not fallen here, but come here with intention, and sat with his hands in his lap. Callum found him there when he came out at first light. He brought the boy inside without making an announcement of it. She was already at the stove. He said only that the boy needed the cut looked at. She turned and took in the arm and the feet and the general state of him, and got the medicine kit from the shelf without asking the history. She cleaned and dressed the cut, while the boy sat very still in the way of a child who has learned that stillness is safer than flinching, who has learned that when adults are moving close, it is better to become a thing that does not require attention. She did not try to make him feel at ease. She worked with the same efficiency she used for everything else, and when she was done with the arm, she looked at him, and then looked at his feet, and he looked at his feet also, and she got more water. Thomas watched from the doorway. Clara came in and sat down across from the boy and looked at him the way she looked at things that interested her, steadily and without agenda. She asked him what his name was. The boy looked at her and said nothing. Clara considered this for a moment. She said her name was Clara, that her brother's name was Thomas, and that the woman at the basin was Mrs. Harlan. She said all of this as a courtesy, as information that might be useful. Then she pulled her porridge bowl toward her and started eating. The boy watched her eat. Callum stood in the kitchen and looked at the boy and at her, and she understood, without anything being said, that this was a situation requiring consideration. The boy was Comanche. That was a fact with a weight to it in this territory in this year. The cut in the feet and the long nights walking were also facts, and they had a different kind of weight. She covered the boy's feet with a cloth and got him food, and he ate it carefully, with the restraint of someone who has been hungry enough to know that eating too fast is a mistake. The word went around town that Callum Rourke had the Comanche boy at his ranch. It went around in the way things go around, which is to say faster than the truth and with additions, and by the time the men from the eastern settlements arrived, they had a collection of feelings about the situation that pointed mostly in one direction. There were 7 of them. They arrived in the middle of the afternoon, in a group that had the shape of a decision made before the ride and not open to revision. They pulled up in the yard, and Dewhurst, their spokesman, called out before he climbed down from his horse, which told you something about the kind of arrival he intended it to be. Dewhurst was a man with a large voice, and the posture of someone who had learned that a large voice in a room changes a room. He had been in the territory long enough to consider his opinions earned. He had papers rolled in one hand when he climbed down, which she noticed from the kitchen window before she came outside. He said the boy was evidence of a pattern of aggression that had to be stopped. He said keeping the boy was practically an advertisement that the settlers could be picked apart without consequence. He said he had the backing of families from 6 farms in the eastern stretch, and the fear behind those names was real. And he said that giving the boy back sent a message the Comanche bands would read as weakness, and that Callum needed to think hard about what it meant for every family in the valley. Callum listened to all of this from the porch. He did not interrupt. He did not shift his weight or cross his arms or do any of the things a man does when he is preparing a counter-argument. He looked at Dewhurst with the attention of someone who was actually listening, which Dewhurst seemed to find less satisfying than he had anticipated. When Dewhurst finished, Callum said quietly that the boy was a child, not evidence. That the boy had a family somewhere who did not know where he was or whether he was alive. That what Dewhurst was describing, keeping a child to prevent a conversation, was the kind of thing that makes conversations impossible, and that the conversation needed to happen regardless of what was done with the boy. Dewhurst said that was naive. He said it with the confidence of a man who has used the word on other men and found it effective. He said Callum did not understand what was at stake. Callum said he understood fine. There was a pause. Dewhurst looked at his papers and at the men behind him and at Callum, and then he went further than he had perhaps planned to go, in the way that men do when a situation is not going the way they intended. The street had an audience by now. Word had moved the way it moves. She was standing in the doorway of the house, not because she had planned to stand there, but because she had heard the wagons and come out, and the thing taking shape in the yard had kept her there. Thomas was at the window inside. Clara was in the doorway beside her, pressed against the doorframe with both hands. Dewhurst looked at her then. He looked at her with the particular calculation of a man identifying an angle. He said, with his voice pitched to carry past Callum to the street beyond, that it was interesting what a man would risk for a Comanche boy, given what else he apparently had to protect now. He said it with the emphasis of a man landing a point, and there was nothing accidental about any word of it. The yard was quiet. She stood in the doorway with the same composure she had carried off the coach that first afternoon. She did not look at Callum to read what he would do. She did not step back inside. She simply remained where she was, level, in the way of a woman who has stood on ground worse than this and found that steadiness is a choice available regardless of the ground. Clara pressed a little closer against her side. Callum looked at Dewhurst for a moment. He said he would thank Dewhurst not to speak about his household. He said it the way a man states a fact that is not negotiable, without heat, and without any performance of how serious he was. Just the plain statement of it, set down between them, where everyone could see it. Dewhurst started to say something. Callum said the conversation about the boy was finished. He said the boy would be returned to his people, that he would see to it himself, and that if any man in the county wished to make that into a difficulty, they could take it up with him directly, in whatever manner they chose, and he would be available. He said this last part without any particular inflection, which was its own kind of statement. He looked at Dewhurst and waited. Dewhurst had come with a speech that had more sections remaining in it. It had not been constructed for this kind of resistance, and he stood with it in his hand, like a tool for a job that was no longer the job. He looked at the men who had ridden with him. A couple of them were looking at the boards of the porch. The settlement families were real, and their fear was real, and Dewhurst believed in what he was saying. But the man on the porch was not going to move, and the people on the street were watching, and there was a point at which continuing cost more than stopping. He rolled his papers tighter in his fist. He said Callum was making a mistake and would know it before spring. Callum said that was possible. Dewhurst turned and walked back to his horse. The men who had come with him followed, not quickly, not as if they were running, but without any particular ceremony. The wagons turned in the yard and went back down the road to the main street and kept going. The street let out something it had been holding. She went back inside and finished the supper she had started. She did not say anything to Clara about what had just happened. Clara asked one question, which was whether the men were going to come back, and she said she did not think so. Clara accepted this and went to set the table. Callum came in a few minutes later. He hung his coat on the proper hook. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat down. Clara said the bread was good today. Thomas looked at his plate and allowed, after a moment, that it was. Callum said that was enough commentary about bread and reached for the bowl of beans. She almost smiled. She kept her eyes on her plate and kept her expression where it was. He did not look up. It was 2 mornings later that Callum rode out before the household was awake, with the boy sitting in front of him on the horse. She had heard him in the kitchen before first light and had stayed in the back room with the east-facing window and listened to the house adjust to the departure. When she came out, the stove had been started, which she had not asked him to do, and there was coffee on. He was back by midday. He came in and sat down at the table, and she put a plate in front of him without being asked, and he ate it without comment about where he had been or what had happened on the ride. She understood this was not omission. There were things that did not need to be narrated, and this was one of them. What had happened was this. He had ridden into the Comanche camp in the early morning, with the boy visible on the horse in front of him, hands open, unhurried. Near 200 warriors had heard him coming. When he rode in with the child unhurt and unbound, returning a thing that belonged to them without conditions, the weapons came down one at a time, not because they had been ordered to, because the man on the horse was doing something that meant what it appeared to mean. The boy's father came forward. He took the child by the shoulders and held him in the way a man holds something he thought he had lost past the point of finding. Callum sat on his horse and kept his hands where they were and waited without filling the waiting with anything. He rode home with the morning behind him and the land going flat under the horse's feet, and he did not look for anything in it. When he finished what she had left on the plate, he set down his fork and looked at the cloth she had draped over the empty serving bowl, and then he got up and went back outside. The weeks that followed were ordinary in the way of a house that has found its measure and is living in it. Thomas repaired the south fence without being told. Clara learned to braid and practiced on the cat until the cat escaped under the porch. She taught Clara to sew properly, which Clara approached with intense interest and significant impatience for the gap between her interest and her results. November came in cold and clear. The evenings ran long after supper, with the fire going and the wind outside. Clara read aloud from her schoolbook most evenings, to the room in general, with the unself-consciousness of a child who does not require an audience. Thomas occasionally corrected her pronunciation. She told him what he could do with his corrections. Callum sat with the accounting book and appeared not to hear any of it. She sat with the mending and appeared also not to hear any of it, which was not quite true. There was an evening, in the middle of November, when she was alone in the kitchen after the children were in bed and Callum had gone out to check the barn, and she stood at the counter for a moment with nothing in her hands, which was unusual. She looked at the kitchen and the shelf with the things she had learned the story of without being told directly. The glass bottle had been the mother's. The carved animal was Thomas's work from the year before. The photograph lying face down was the mother also. She went and looked out the east window at the cold sky, which had stars in it, clear and precise, and stood there for a minute, thinking nothing in particular. When Callum came in from the barn, she was back at the counter with the mending. He poured a glass of water and stood at the other counter. Neither of them said anything for a while, in the silence of people who have been in the same rooms long enough that silence does not need explaining. He said, after a while, that Thomas had asked him that morning whether she was staying past winter. She did not look up from the mending. He said he had not had a good answer for the question, and it had been occupying him since. She set the mending down. The proposal came on a morning in December, when the ground was hard and the light came early and flat and clear. She was at the stove when he came in from the barn and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter with it and did not drink it. He said he had been thinking about the question Thomas had asked. She waited. He said the children needed a permanent arrangement. He said the house needed a permanent arrangement. He said he had money set aside, not a great deal, and he named the amount plainly. He said he was aware she had not come to this territory expecting any of what had happened, that she had come expecting a homestead and had arrived to find the ground already claimed. He looked at the counter. He said he was aware also that he was not the arrangement she would have chosen for herself if the arrangement had been hers to make. He said this plainly and without self-deprecation, simply as a statement of what was true. He said he thought they managed the work well between them. He said the house was better and the children were better, and he thought she knew that. He said he was not a man who would tell her how to run the house or what to do with herself, within reason and outside of what the ranch required. He said he thought she deserved a ground to stand on that nobody could take back from her because it was filed in her own name, and no absent husband or lapses in improvement work could undo it. He said that was what he was offering. He drank his coffee then, the whole cup, and set it down. She stood at the stove with a dish towel over one arm and looked at the window for a moment. The glass had frost along the lower edge. The light through it was clean and cold and plain, the kind of light that doesn't dress things up. She looked at it for the length of time it took to be sure she was thinking clearly and not just thinking quickly. She said she would need to think on it. He said that was fine. He put down his cup and went back outside. She stood in the kitchen for a while after that. She thought about the back room with the window facing east and what it had taken to make a room someone else's feel like hers, which was not warmth so much as work and time. She thought about Thomas staying at the table. She thought about Clara pressed close in the doorway when the men had come with their papers. She went to the doorway and called after him before he reached the barn. He turned. She said she had thought on it. He waited. She said yes. He looked at her for a moment across the cold morning yard. Something moved across his face that did not get very far before he put it away. He nodded once, the way he nodded, which was the end of a sentence. He turned and went to the barn. She went back inside and finished breakfast and called the children. Clara came down the stairs at a run and said she was hungry. Thomas came down after her, unhurried, and took his place at the table and pulled his plate toward him and looked at what was on it, and then looked up at her with the look he had developed over the preceding weeks, which was not the withheld judgment of the early days, but something she had been careful not to name, because naming it would make it smaller than it was. She set down his cup and went back to the stove. He said quietly, after a moment, that he had heard her say yes. She said she supposed he had. He picked up his cup. Clara said loudly from behind a piece of toast that she had heard it too, and that she was glad, and that this meant Mrs. Harlan was staying, which she said as a statement of settled fact and not as a question requiring confirmation. She said it as though she were noting that the frost was on the windows, and the fire was going, and the bread was not hard on either side. Thomas told her to be quiet and eat. Clara told him she would eat and talk at the same time because she was capable of more than one thing simultaneously. Callum came in from the barn and hung up his coat and sat down, and neither child said anything further on the subject. He looked at neither of them. He reached for the bread. She sat down at the table, which was something she did not always do in the mornings, and there was a moment in which everyone was eating, and nobody was saying anything, and the fire was going, and the cold sat outside the windows doing its work, and the house sat warm against it, doing its work back. And she looked at the table and the people around it, and thought that this was what the word settled felt like from the inside. They married in March, in a small ceremony at the church in town, with the Reverend and the Aldrich family, and 2 of Callum's ranch hands present. Clara complained on the ride-in that her dress was tight across the shoulders. Thomas told her she could either stop pulling at it, or she could look like she had been pulling at it all morning. Clara considered this and stopped pulling at it. Callum stood at the front of the church with the stillness of a man who is not accustomed to being looked at collectively. He had made an effort with his clothes that was visible without being fussy, and he looked out at the small room with the expression of a man who is doing something he has decided is right. She walked down that short aisle with the composure she had worn off the coach in September, the chin level, the bearing of a woman who has already done the harder things and found them manageable. Her dress was the good one she had saved for the occasion, properly pressed, and it survived the occasion. The Reverend said the words. They said the words back. "Fuzz," Aldrich cried, which nobody had asked her to do, and which Clara observed with the complete directness of a child who has not learned yet that staring is a commentary. Thomas put a hand on Clara's shoulder, not forcefully, just there, and Clara's attention returned to the front of the room. After the ceremony, there was a supper at the ranch, with a fire going, and more food than usual, and the evening running long. Clara ate 2 pieces of cake, and would have eaten a third, except that Thomas removed the opportunity quietly and without a scene. Callum sat at the head of the table, and was present the way he was always present, which was to say more than his words would have suggested. Clara fell asleep in the chair by the fire eventually, the way children do, without transition, one moment talking and then gone. Callum carried her up without waking her, which he had done before, and which he did now with the same ease and care. She watched him go up the stairs with the sleeping child, and thought that this was one of the things she had learned about him, that no one had told her. Thomas sat at the table with a cup of warm milk after everyone else had gone up, in the way he sometimes sat, not because he needed the milk, but because he needed the sitting. She was tidying the last of the supper things. The fire had burned down to the good steady heat that comes after the early brightness. He said, without looking at her, that he was glad she had stayed. She set down what she was holding and looked at him. He was looking at the cup. She said she was glad too. He nodded once. He finished his milk. He said good night and went up the stairs. She stood in the kitchen for a while after. The fire settled in the grate. The house was quiet around her, in the way a house is quiet when everyone in it is settled, a different quality of quiet than absence. The shelf in the back room had the photograph on it, the one that had been lying face down when she arrived. She had turned it upright some weeks ago without asking permission, because the woman in it deserved to be seen, and the house had room for more than one thing to be true. She had added nothing to the shelf and taken nothing away. She was not a replacement for anything. She had not come here to fill a shape that someone else had left. She had come here with a dead husband and a lapsed claim, and a pressed dress that had not survived the journey, and she had worked, and she had been steady, and she had said yes to a man who asked plainly and meant it, and the ground she was standing on now was hers, filed in her own name. No more waiting. The house held its warmth against the cold outside. The fire settled once more and went quiet. Through the window the land ran out dark and still to the tree line, and the stars above it were clear and sharp in the cold air, the way stars are in the open country, when there is nothing between them and you. And the last thing she heard before the night went fully quiet was the barn, shifting once, the way old wood shifts in cold weather, finding its ease, and then nothing. If you have ever found something worth holding on to simply by staying where you were, leave a word below and let others know they are not alone in that.